I want to be very clear about something before I begin this account. I, Qurel the sixth Brak of Thessan, am not someone who startles easily. I have witnessed the burning collapse of the Dorvani moons. I have sat in the same room as a Velkreth negotiator while it consumed a live creature mid-sentence, without even pausing to chew. I have watched High Delegate Orvok sneeze so violently that 3 junior aides were knocked off their feet and 1 lost a mandible. I have seen things, is what I am saying, terrible, strange, and deeply unsettling things. And yet, nothing, not a single event in my 47 rotations of diplomatic service prepared me for the day a human walked into the Galactic Summit on Praxxis Station unarmed, smiled at the security checkpoint like she was arriving at a pleasant brunch, and caused every single security drone in the building to short-circuit simultaneously. I am going to tell you exactly what happened. I am going to tell you because the official record is, to put it diplomatically, incomplete. And by incomplete, I mean someone removed 11 minutes of footage, 2 entire witness testimonies, and 1 security report that I personally watched get written, printed, and then immediately set on fire by a very nervous Vithosi technician who claimed it was an accident. It was not an accident. Nobody accidentally sets fire to a data slate. That is a deliberate action that requires both intent and a functioning ignition source. But I was there. I saw everything. And I have a very good memory, which has historically been both a gift and a burden. Mostly a burden if I am honest. So let us begin. The Galactic Summit of Praxxis Station happened once every 11 standard cycles, and it was, without exaggeration, the single most politically sensitive event in the known galaxy. Every major species sent delegates. Every minor species sent observers. Every species that was technically on the fence about whether they counted as a civilization yet sent someone to stand near the entrance and look hopeful. The station itself was enormous, a rotating disk of corridors, conference halls, and catering facilities so vast that first-time visitors sometimes got lost for days. One the Luxy envoy famously wandered into a maintenance shaft on his second day and was not found until the closing ceremony, at which point he was dehydrated but had apparently come to several important personal realizations. Security was, to put it mildly, intense. The Vithosi handled it, which made sense, since Praxxis Station existed inside Vithosi-claimed space and the Vithosi took their security responsibilities with the sort of grave, humorless dedication usually reserved for religious devotion. Their chief of station security was a being named Sovi Drak, who had approximately 6 limbs, no discernible sense of humor, and the kind of gaze that made you feel immediately guilty for things you had not yet done. Sovi Drak ran a very tight operation. Every delegate was scanned, catalogued, genetically verified, and made to walk through no fewer than 4 separate detection fields before being permitted beyond the entry corridor. Weapons of any kind were confiscated immediately. Weapons that were not immediately obvious, like certain Gorathi biological modifications or the specific glands that Relureshi ambassadors used to secrete paralytic compounds, were also flagged, documented, and subject to an extremely awkward conversation that went on record. Nothing got through Sovi Drak's checkpoint. Nothing had ever gotten through. The Vithosi were justifiably proud of this fact, and Sovi Drak had been known to bring it up unprompted at dinner functions, which made her very popular at some tables and less popular at others. Humans had been attending the summit for 6 cycles now, ever since their application for provisional species status had been approved by a vote of 11 to 8, with 2 abstentions that everyone understood to be secret yeses from delegates who did not want the political attention. The humans were new, they were small, biologically speaking, they were by nearly every measurable standard underpowered compared to the other species in the room. They had no natural armor, no toxin glands, no echolocation, no psychic capability, and their sensory range was, frankly, embarrassing. They could not even see ultraviolet light. I once watched a human delegate walk directly into a clearly marked UV visible barrier and bounce off it with a look of complete surprise. She did not appear injured. She seemed mostly annoyed. And yet, there is that phrase again. Humans had a quality that was difficult to categorize and impossible to ignore. The closest word in my language is something like boldness, but that is not quite right either. Boldness implies confidence, and confidence implies an accurate understanding of one's own capabilities. What humans had was something different, something that looked like confidence from the outside, but was, upon closer examination, something closer to a complete and total refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure. It was not that they were brave, it was that they had apparently not yet been informed that fear was a reasonable response to certain situations, and nobody had bothered to tell them. The human delegate assigned to this cycle's summit was a woman named Dara Voss. I want to say her name clearly, because she deserves the credit, and also because I think the people who removed those 11 minutes of footage deserve to know that at least one witness remembers everything perfectly. Dara Voss. She was, by human standards, average in most respects. Medium height, medium build, dark hair cut short in a way that I later learned was considered professional in certain human contexts. She had what humans describe as brown eyes, which is one of their more boring color descriptors, though I understand they only have a limited range to work with. She smiled often, sometimes at appropriate moments, and sometimes at moments when a smile was the last thing anyone in the room was expecting. She spoke 4 human languages, and had a working knowledge of 3 galactic ones, which was better than most human delegates, but not exceptional by broader standards. Her diplomatic credentials were solid. Her record was unremarkable in the specific sense that she had attended 16 prior minor summits and had not caused any international incidents at any of them. That streak, it turned out, was about to end spectacularly. The morning of the first session, I was standing near the entry corridor with my colleague Brek, who serves as a secondary observer for the Thessan delegation. Brek is a small being easily startled and prone to what he calls precautionary pessimism, which means he assumes the worst outcome for every situation and then feels vindicated whenever anything goes slightly wrong, even if it was a completely different kind of wrong than the one he predicted. He had spent the morning predicting that the Garathi delegates would cause a scene at the catering station, which was statistically likely given Garathi history with Praxxis Station's catering coordinator. Instead, the scene came from somewhere else entirely. I noticed Dara Voss the moment she came through the outer airlock, because she was the only delegate in the entire entry corridor who was not accompanied by a security team. Every other representative had at least 2 aides and 1 bodyguard. The Vithosi High Delegate had 17 attendants and a personal drone that hovered precisely 6 inches above his left shoulder at all times. The Garathi sent 5 delegates who all walked in a tight cluster so that it was functionally impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Even the Shalurath observers, who were technically pacifists, had a small robotic escort that was allegedly unarmed but had attachments that looked suspiciously purposeful. Dara Voss walked in alone. She had a bag. One bag. A small bag that sat on her right shoulder with the casual ease of someone who was either completely unbothered by her surroundings or had simply not thought very hard about them. She was wearing the standard human diplomatic uniform, which is a dark jacket and matching trousers with a small pin on the lapel indicating her species and station. She was looking around the corridor with the bright, interested expression of someone who has arrived somewhere new and finds the whole thing rather exciting. Brek noticed her at the same moment I did. He made a low sound that in his species indicates either mild concern or extreme concern depending on the pitch. This was the higher pitch. "Is that human unaccompanied?" he asked. "Apparently," I said. "Why is she unaccompanied?" "I have absolutely no idea. Is she authorized to be unaccompanied?" "She is a delegate, Brek. She can presumably walk into a building." Brek made another sound. "Something is wrong," he said. This was his default conclusion about most situations, but it landed differently this time. Dara Voss had reached the first security checkpoint. The checkpoint was staffed by 2 Vithosi officers in full tactical gear and supported by a row of security drones, each about the size of a medium-range shuttle, hovering silently in a line above the corridor. The drones were armed, scanner-equipped, and capable of responding to a threat in approximately 0.003 standard seconds, which is faster than most species could even register that something had happened. She walked up to the checkpoint, smiled at the 2 officers, and set her bag on the scanning surface. One of the officers, a young Vithosi named Gel, who I later learned was on only his 2nd major deployment, ran the standard scan sequence. The bag came back clear. Standard diplomatic contents, data slate, personal provisions, a small device that registered as a communication tool and nothing else. Then Gel ran the biological scan on Dara Voss herself. Standard procedure. Everyone got it. The scanner checks for concealed weapons, biological modifications, chemical agents, and about 60 other categories of things that are not permitted past the checkpoint. For most delegates, it takes about 4 seconds and produces a clean readout with a green indicator and a quiet tone. The scanner took 11 seconds. It produced no readout, and then it turned off, not powered down, not cycled into standby mode, turned off. The screen went dark, the indicator lights went out, and the gentle background hum that the device made when operating faded into silence. Gel stared at the scanner. Dara Voss looked at the scanner. They both looked at each other. Hun, said Dara Voss. Gel pressed the restart sequence. The scanner did not restart. He pressed it again. Still nothing. He pressed 3 different buttons in a sequence that I was told later was the Vithosi equivalent of "Please, I am begging you." The scanner remained entirely and completely inert. The second officer, a more senior being named Trax, stepped forward and tried her own override code. Nothing. She called into her communicator for technical support, and a Vithosi technician arrived within 90 seconds, checked the device, looked deeply troubled, checked it again, and then said something to Trax in a low voice that I could not hear, but that resulted in Trax's expression doing something I had never seen a Vithosi face do before. She looked uncertain. Meanwhile, the drones above the corridor had begun to behave strangely. I noticed it first because I was watching the corridor, not the checkpoint. The drones, which normally maintain their precise, motionless hovering positions with the mechanical reliability of something that has never once doubted itself, had started to drift. Barely. Small lateral movements, a few inches in either direction, like they were being pushed very gently by a wind that did not exist. Their scanner arrays had rotated to point downward toward Dara Voss, which was normal response protocol for an unresolved checkpoint situation. But then the arrays rotated back, and then forward again, and then the drones stopped. All 7 of them, not drifted to a stop, stopped, mid-hover, mid-function, in the same absolute way that the checkpoint scanner had stopped. Their lights went out. Their engines, which produced a constant low vibration that you felt more than heard, fell silent, and then, very slowly, because the anti-gravity systems were also no longer operating, all 7 of them began to descend. The corridor, which had been moderately busy with other arriving delegates, became very quiet very fast. 7 enormous security drones drifting downward in complete silence is the kind of sight that rearranges your priorities almost immediately. Breck grabbed my arm. I did not tell him to let go because honestly I was glad for the contact. Around us, delegates and aides were backing away from the descent zone, most of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had attended enough diplomatic events to recognize a potentially catastrophic situation and had strong opinions about not being standing underneath one when it resolved. The drones landed. They landed with the heavy, definitive sound of extremely large machines meeting a floor with no remaining capacity for flight. One of them tilted slightly as it settled, and a secondary wing panel unfolded halfway before stopping, giving it the look of something mid-shrug. The corridor was now significantly more crowded with grounded equipment than it had been 30 seconds ago, and significantly less well secured. Dara Voss looked up at the drones. She looked at the checkpoint. She looked at Gel and Trax, who were both staring at her with the specific expression of beings who were having a very difficult time determining what to put in their incident report. Then she looked back at the grounded drones and tilted her head to one side. Muttered Dukal. Is this, she said. Is this normal? Should I stand somewhere else? Nobody answered her immediately. The corridor had gone so quiet that you could hear the distant hum of the station's atmospheric processors. Then Sovi Drak arrived. I had seen Sovi Drak from across rooms before during prior summit cycles, but I had never been this close to her. She was tall even by Vithosi standards, and she moved through the frozen corridor with the controlled urgency of someone who is extremely angry and has decided to express it entirely through the speed and precision of their footsteps. She wore the full tactical insignia of Vithosi Security Command, and every one of her 6 limbs was moving with an independent purposefulness that gave the impression of a being who had dedicated each appendage to a separate task, all of them related to containment. She stopped in front of Dara Voss. Dara Voss looked up at her. Sovi Drak was significantly taller. This did not appear to bother Dara Voss in any way. "Delegate Voss," said Sovi Drak. "Yes. Hi, hello," said Dara Voss. "I think something went wrong with your scanner." "I am aware," said Sovi Drak. "And your drones, I am also aware." "Did I do something?" asked Dara Voss. And here is the thing that I find most remarkable in retrospect. Because I was watching her face very carefully, she seemed genuinely unsure. Not guilty, not nervous. Genuinely, openly, curiously unsure, the way you would be if you had walked into a room and found the furniture arranged strangely and were trying to figure out when that had happened. Sovi Drak studied her for a long moment with all 4 of her forward-facing optical sensors, which in Vithosi biology indicates a level of focused attention that borders on the combative. Dara Voss maintained eye contact without apparent difficulty. I watched Breck slowly move behind me. I did not blame him. "Please follow me," said Sovi Drak. "Sure," said Dara Voss. She picked up her bag from the scanning surface. Should I bring this? Yes. Okay. She followed Sovi Drak toward the secondary security office without any apparent concern, and as she walked away she glanced back over her shoulder at the grounded drones with the expression of someone who finds a thing mildly interesting and plans to think about it later. Brek exhaled very loudly beside me. I told you, he said. I told you something was wrong. You predicted the Gorathi, I said. Something was wrong, he repeated, as if this was the important point. Around us, the corridor was slowly returning to movement. Technicians had arrived and were swarming over the drones with the frantically efficient energy of people whose day had just become significantly more complicated. The checkpoint scanners were being checked by 3 separate individuals simultaneously. Someone was speaking rapidly into a communicator in a tone that I recognized as the universal sound of a person explaining a very bad situation to someone who did not yet know it was very bad. I looked at the door through which Sovi Drak and Dara Voss had disappeared. I made a decision that I would later describe to Brek as a professional obligation to observe, and that Brek would later describe as the most irresponsible thing I have ever seen you do. I followed them. The secondary security office was a small utilitarian room that smelled of metal and the particular antiseptic compound that Vathosi facilities favored, and that always made my sensory organs feel slightly scorched. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wall of monitoring equipment, and a secondary door that led to a holding area that I dearly hoped we were not heading toward. Sovi Drak sat across from Dara Voss with 3 of her upper limbs resting flat on the table, which I had read was a Vathosi gesture, indicating that direct hostility had been set aside in favor of questioning. It is a formality. The hostility is still there. It has simply been filed for later reference. I had managed to get inside by flashing my observer credentials to the officer at the door, who either decided they were sufficient or was too overwhelmed by the current situation to argue. I stood near the back of the room. Nobody told me to leave. I counted this as a success. Delegate Voss, Sovi Drak began, I need you to understand the seriousness of the current situation. Okay, said Dara Voss. Every scanning and security system in entry corridor 7 failed simultaneously upon your arrival. 7 armed security drones went offline, 2 checkpoint scanners, 1 passive monitoring array, and 1 environmental alert system all ceased functioning within a 14-second window. Right, said Dara Voss. This has never happened before. I believe that. Can you explain it? Dara Voss was quiet for a moment. She had set her bag on the floor beside her chair, and she had her hands folded on the table in front of her, which I would later learn from a brief text I found on human diplomatic conduct, was intended to signal openness and honesty. She looked like she was thinking carefully, not about what to hide, but about how to say something accurately. I cannot explain it, she said. I genuinely cannot. I did not do anything. I just walked up to the checkpoint. I have not touched any equipment. I have no modifications. I have nothing in my bag that should interact with your systems in that way. I can show you everything I have. I can consent to any scan that actually works. She paused. I am sorry about the drones. That must be extremely inconvenient. Sovi Drak looked at her. The look lasted approximately 7 full seconds, which in Vathosi body language spans a significant emotional range, all of which I found deeply difficult to read. You said you consent to a scan, Sovi Drak said. Yes. We will need to use a portable unit. The fixed systems are… Sovi Drak glanced at a display on the wall, where a technician's update was scrolling. Currently, non-operational. Okay, said Dara Voss. Should I take off my jacket? That will not be necessary. I just, I want to cooperate. I am really not trying to be a problem. She looked at Sovi Drak with an expression that was entirely sincere, and somehow that sincerity was the most disarming thing in the room. Sovi Drak, who had presumably been prepared for denial, or aggression, or the particular evasive diplomatic language that most delegates used when cornered, seemed briefly at a loss. She called for a portable scanner. One arrived within 3 minutes, carried by a technician who handled it with visible care and what I can only describe as the energy of someone who has been told very clearly not to break this one. The scan took place. It took about 90 seconds, which was longer than the standard checkpoint version, and produced a full readout. Sovi Drak studied it. The technician studied it. A second technician who arrived just as the scan completed also studied it. Dara Voss waited. You are, Sovi Drak said slowly, entirely unmodified. Yes, said Dara Voss. No concealed equipment. No. No biochemical agents. No. Nothing that should interact with our systems in any way. I know, said Dara Voss. I know, I am as confused as you are, honestly. I doubt that, said Sovi Drak, which was the most honest thing said in that room all morning. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has weight to it, the kind that you can feel pressing on the air from all sides. Am I being detained? Asked Dara Voss. Sovi Drak considered this. It was legally a question with implications. Delegates to the Galactic Summit held provisional immunity during travel to and from the station. Detaining one without documented cause was the kind of thing that generated formal complaints, interspecies review boards, and the extremely tedious series of diplomatic correspondence that resulted from both. Sovi Drak was not, in my observation, the kind of being who enjoyed paperwork. She was the kind of being who enjoyed operational efficiency, and detaining an uncaused delegate was the opposite of that. No, she said finally. Okay, said Dara Voss. She reached down and picked up her bag. Then I would really like to get to the opening session if that is all right. I think it starts in 20 minutes and I have not eaten today, and I was hoping to find something at the catering station first. She said this the way a person says a thing that is both true and completely reasonable, and both of those qualities made it somehow worse. Sovi Drak stared at her for a very long moment. Then she said, "You will be escorted to the session." "That is totally fine," said Dara Voss. "Thank you." She stood up, smoothed her jacket, and waited with the patient ease of someone who had found the whole thing mildly interesting but was ready to move on now. Sovi Drak called for 2 officers to accompany her and watched Dara Voss leave the room with the expression of a being who has just been handed a problem that does not fit any of the available categories. I left after her. Nobody stopped me. In the corridor I caught up to Drak, who had apparently followed me at a distance and was now attempting to look like he had simply arrived in this location coincidentally. "Well," he said. "They could not find anything." I said. "What do you mean they could not find anything?" "I mean exactly that. She has nothing on her." The scan came back completely clean. Drak made his high-pitched sound again. "Then why did everything break?" "That," I said, "is a very good question." The opening session of the summit was held in the Grand Convergence Hall, which was a room so large that the far end was technically in a different atmospheric pressure zone and had to be adjusted accordingly. The seating was arranged in a concentric pattern with the central table reserved for primary delegates and the outer rings for observers and secondary representatives. Above the central table hung the Convergence Seal, an ancient symbol of galactic cooperation that predated 7 of the current member species and that nobody had ever quite agreed on the original meaning of, which was either poetic or embarrassing depending on your perspective. Dara Voss was seated at the central table between the representative from the Velmunta Accord, a very tall being named Toss, who had what appeared to be natural armor plating on his shoulders, and the general demeanor of someone who had been deeply disappointed by the galaxy and had decided to be very formal about it, and the secondary Gorathi cluster, which had arranged itself into a configuration that took up approximately 1.5 seats. She ate a small meal she had apparently obtained from the catering station during the escort, and she ate it with the focused attention of someone who was quite hungry and not especially self-conscious about it. Dots watched her with undisguised fascination. The Gorathi cluster rippled, which in Gorathi body language can mean either curiosity or mild offense, and is frequently both simultaneously. High Delegate Orvak opened the session. He was an elder Vithosi of considerable standing, and he spoke with the measured precision of someone who had given important speeches for so long that he had started to feel his words had physical weight and was being careful not to drop them. He welcomed all attending species. He noted the significance of this cycle's agenda. He made a carefully worded statement about the ongoing boundary discussions in the South Corridor that managed to say approximately nothing while technically addressing the topic, which was an impressive achievement. And then, because the summit agenda required it, the floor was open for the standard round of delegate introductions. Most species gave prepared statements. The Gorathi cluster produced a sound that was later translated as a formal greeting, though 3 different translators gave 3 different versions, and the version that appeared in the official record was, by general consensus, the most diplomatic interpretation available. The Velmunta representative Toas delivered 12 sentences of greeting in a voice so flat that it sounded like a reading from a technical manual. When it was the human turn, Dara Voss stood up. She looked around the room. The Grand Convergence Hall held several hundred beings in various configurations, and they were all in that moment looking at her. Some of them had heard about the entry corridor incident. Word travels fast in a sealed station. Many of them had been briefed on humans in the abstract way that you brief someone on a new species. Small, limited sensory range, biologically fragile, surprisingly aggressive historically, currently in a provisional status that several species were still quietly skeptical of. Dara Voss looked at all of them. She smiled. "Hello," she said, into the Convergence microphone, in Standard Galactic, which she spoke with an accent that was unmistakably human but perfectly comprehensible. "My name is Dara Voss. I am the representative of the United Human Compact for this cycle. I am very glad to be here." She paused. "I apologize about the drones," she added. "I genuinely do not know what happened." There was a silence. And then, from somewhere in the outer rings of seating, a sound began that took me a moment to identify. It was laughter. Not human laughter specifically. Galactic laughter. The Shalurith observers were producing their rhythmic clicking sound. The Gorathi cluster rippled again, faster this time, in the pattern that their cultural liaison had once explained was their version of amusement. 3 of the Velmunta secondary delegates made a low resonant sound that translated loosely as something like, "I find this acceptable." Even Taz, the stony primary delegate sitting next to Dara Voss, made a very small movement with the plating on his left shoulder that his own cultural liaison, sitting behind him, caught and immediately noted in their record with what I suspect was great personal satisfaction. High Delegate Orvak, to his credit, managed to maintain his formal expression, but his secondary eyes, which Vithosi use for peripheral vision and which are much harder to control than the forward ones, crinkled slightly at the outer corners. Dara Voss sat back down. Drak, who was sitting next to me in the observer ring, leaned over and said very quietly, "She did that on purpose." "Did what?" I said. "The apology. About the drones. She did it on purpose. She knew the whole room would have heard about it, and she addressed it immediately, on the record, with an apology before anyone else could bring it up." I considered this. "She is very fast," I said. "Yes," said Drak. He sounded troubled. He often sounded troubled. But this time there was something else underneath it, something that took me a moment to identify, because it was not a sound I associated with Drak. It was respect. The session continued for several hours. Agenda items were discussed. Preliminary positions were stated. The Gorathi cluster submitted a formal objection to the seating arrangement on the grounds that their spatial requirements had been miscalculated, which everyone knew was a standard Gorathi opening move and had been anticipated in the pre-session briefing materials. The Stealth Corridor discussion was opened, briefly, and then very firmly closed again when it became clear that the Velmunta Accord and the Dorvani Remnant both intended to make statements that were technically civil but practically incendiary. Throughout all of this, I watched Dara Voss. She paid attention. Full attention. The kind that is visible from across a room because the person's head does not move toward distractions and their posture does not shift when something uninteresting is being said. She took notes on her data slate with focused speed. When other delegates spoke, she watched the speaker and the room simultaneously, and her eyes tracked the reactions of neighboring delegates in the quick, observational way of someone who is reading the room while listening to the words, both things at once. She also at one point appeared to have a brief, quiet conversation with Toz. I could not hear it, but Toz, who had maintained approximately the same expression and posture through the entire session, tilted his head toward her and responded to whatever she said with something that lasted about 4 seconds, and when he straightened again, the set of his shoulder plating had changed very slightly. It was for Toz, essentially a warm response. At the end of the first session, I watched several delegates leave quickly, and several others move toward the central table for informal conversations. Dara Voss was approached by 4 different beings within the first 3 minutes of session close, which was an unusual number for a delegate from a provisional species at their first major summit. I made my way down toward the floor. I was not exactly sure why. Professional curiosity, perhaps. The same thing that had sent me into that security office, that slightly irresponsible instinct that tells you that you are watching something worth watching and you should stay close. I got close enough to overhear part of a conversation between Dara Voss and a Velmunta secondary delegate named Ova, who was one of the beings who had made the low resonant approval sound during the introduction. "The drone incident," Ova was saying. "There is talk." "I imagine there is," said Dara Voss. "Some delegates are concerned." "That is reasonable," said Dara Voss. "I am a little concerned myself, honestly." "Are you?" Ova studied her. Velmunta had compound visual organs that processed light in ranges humans cannot perceive. Whatever Ova was seeing when she looked at Dara Voss, she was seeing more of it than I was. "Yes," said Dara Voss. "I walked into a building, and the security systems failed. That worries me. Not for political reasons, just, practically. What does that mean for the station? If there is something about me or about my equipment or about some signal from my ship that interfered with the systems, that is information that the station's security team should have. I told Chief Drak that I would make myself available for whatever follow-up testing they want to do. Ova was quiet. You volunteered for additional testing, she said. Of course, said Dara Voss. It is the right thing to do. Ova made the resonant sound again, longer this time. She inclined her upper body toward Dara Voss in what her cultural briefing document described as a gesture of considered regard, and then she moved away toward her own delegation's gathering point. Dara Voss turned slightly and noticed me. She looked at me with the direct, open, entirely comfortable gaze of someone who does not find being observed particularly threatening. Hi, she said. Hello, I said. Qurel of Thessan, secondary observer. Dara Voss. I think you already know that part. She smiled. You were in the security office earlier. I processed, briefly, whether I should explain myself. Then I decided that she had already identified my presence and there was not much to explain. I said. Interesting call, she said, following us in there. That must have taken some confidence. Or poor judgment, I said. She laughed. It was a short, quick sound, and it was completely genuine, which was somehow surprising. Most diplomatic laughter is performed. Hers was real. Probably both, she said. Are you going to the second session briefing this afternoon? Yes, I said, though I had not been entirely certain of this until she asked. Good, she said. Maybe we can compare notes. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. I need to go check in with my liaison, and also find out if the catering station has anything that does not contain sulfurous compounds, because I found out during the lunch break that 3 of the dishes I tried are extremely incompatible with human biology, and I would like to avoid a repeat of that experience. She walked away across the hall, nodding to a Shalurith observer as she passed, exchanging a brief word with a Gorathi cultural aide who seemed startled by the interaction, and disappearing through the side corridor toward the delegate services area. I stood where she had left me for a moment. Drak appeared at my elbow. You talked to her, he said. Briefly, I said. What is she like? I thought about it. I thought about the smile at the checkpoint, the apology in the session, calculated and sincere at the same time, the full attention during the proceedings, the conversation with Ova, the easy laugh, the offer of additional testing. She is very careful, I said, and she makes it look like she is not. Drak made his sound, the lower pitch this time, the mild concern one. That, he said, is the most interesting thing you have said all day. He was right, it was. And the day, as it turned out, was nowhere near finished. Because at 1800 station time, during the informal networking period that the summit schedule listed as optional but encouraged, every monitoring system in the delegate residential wing of Praxxis Station went dark for exactly 11 minutes. And during those 11 minutes, someone tried to access the summit's classified negotiation archive, and the only delegate who was verified to still be in her room during that window, alone, with no alibi necessary because the logs confirmed it before the systems failed, was Dara Voss. Except the access attempt was traced to a terminal 3 corridors away from her room, and the security footage of who used that terminal was in the 11 minutes that someone removed. And Sovi Drak was standing in the entry to the residential wing with an expression I had never seen on any face before, of any species, anywhere, when I arrived there 17 minutes after the systems came back online. She was not looking at the terminal. She was not looking at the damage report on her communicator. She was not looking at any of the things a security chief would normally be looking at in this situation. She was looking at the door to Dara Voss's room, and the door was open, and the room was empty. Let me tell you something about empty rooms. An empty room, in most circumstances, is simply a room that does not currently contain anyone. It is not threatening, it is not meaningful, it is just a space between 4 walls that happens to be unoccupied. Empty rooms are everywhere. Entire sections of Praxxis Station were empty rooms. Nobody looked at them with the expression Sovi Drak was currently wearing, because most empty rooms had not, until approximately 40 seconds ago, contained a delegate whose presence was now urgently required by a station security investigation. The door to Dara Voss's quarters stood open at about a 45-degree angle. I could see past it from where I was standing in the corridor, a compact delegate suite, neatly arranged, with her jacket folded over the back of the chair and her data slate sitting on the desk beside a small container of what I assumed were human provisions. The lights were on. The room had all the signs of recent normal occupation, except that the person who occupied it was not there. Sovi Drak had not moved since I arrived. She was standing very still in the way that extremely angry beings sometimes go still, not because they are calm, but because they have decided that movement would be inefficient until they had a direction to move in. When did the logs confirm she was in the room? I asked. I was aware that asking questions was probably not my place. I asked anyway. Nobody stopped me. Sovi Drak answered without looking at me, which told me she was either too focused to bother identifying who was speaking or was already aware I was there and had decided my presence was an acceptable variable for the moment. The room sensor confirmed her presence at 1743 station time, she said. The residential monitoring went dark at 1800, came back online at 1811. By 1813, when my officer did a manual corridor check, the door was open and the room was empty. Could she have left during the blackout window? I asked. Yes, said Sovi Drak. That is precisely the problem. 11 minutes. 11 minutes with no cameras, no door sensors, no corridor monitoring, and no automated logging of any kind. In 11 minutes, on a station the size of Praxxis, a human with a good understanding of the layout could theoretically move between multiple locations. The question was whether Dara Voss had that understanding, and the answer, given everything that had already happened today, was something I was not prepared to assume either way. An officer named Petro, young, nervous-looking and apparently the one responsible for the manual corridor check, was hovering near the wall with a communicator in one of his two upper limbs, and the expression of someone who has delivered one piece of bad news and is preparing to deliver a second one, and does not feel ready for it. Chief Drak, he said, and then stopped. Speak, said Sovi Drak. The delegate has been located. Silence. Where? Said Sovi Drak. The catering station, said Petro, sub-level 4. She is eating. The silence that followed this was different from the silence before it. The silence before it had been tense and investigative. This silence was something more specific. It was the silence of a situation that had just become more complicated in a direction nobody had quite prepared for. She is eating, Sovi Drak repeated. Yes, Chief. She appears to have found the station's secondary catering facility, which is the one used primarily by maintenance crews and service staff. It is not listed in the delegate information materials. Petro paused. She has a tray. She is sitting at a table. She is talking to one of the station's environmental maintenance workers. His name is Qurel. He is not a delegate. Breck, who had materialized beside me at some point during this exchange in the way that Breck materialized in places, which was silently and slightly later than you expected, leaned close to my ear. She found the staff catering station, he said very quietly. I heard, I said. That facility is not on any official map provided to delegates. I know. How did she find it? That, I said, is an excellent question. We went to sub-level 4. By we, I mean Sovi Drak, 2 officers including Petro, and by what I can only describe as accumulated momentum, myself and Breck, who had decided at this point that being separated from the situation was more alarming than being inside it. The secondary catering station was a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of cooking compounds and machine lubricant, which I understood to be a combination unique to spaces where maintenance staff took their breaks. It was lit with the practical, unforgiving brightness of a working room rather than the softer ambient lighting of delegate areas, and the tables were simple functional surfaces with attached seating that had been designed for comfort during short breaks rather than diplomatic entertaining. Dara Voss was sitting at a table near the far wall. She had a tray in front of her containing what appeared to be several items from the maintenance crew menu, which was a separate, much simpler, and apparently significantly less sulfur-containing set of options than the delegate catering. She had a cup of something warm. She was talking to Qurel, who was a Vathosi maintenance worker of middle age with the specific kind of relaxed posture that comes from being very good at a job that most people do not think about. He was talking back to her with the animated ease of someone who had not expected to have an interesting conversation during his evening break and was pleasantly surprised by it. She saw us when we were still 20 feet away. She did not startle. She did not freeze. She did not look guilty or worried or even particularly surprised. She watched us approach with the same open, interested attention she had brought to everything else today, and when Sovi Drak stopped at the edge of her table, she said, Chief Drak, hi, do you want to sit down? I think there are chairs. Sovi Drak did not sit down. Delegate Voss, she said. Yes, you are required to remain in your assigned quarters during the post-session period while an active security review is in process. Oh, said Dara Voss. She looked genuinely taken aback by this, not guilty, just, apparently, unaware. I did not know that. Was that communicated? I may have missed it. I am sorry, I was reviewing session notes and I got hungry, and I asked Qurel here, she gestured to the maintenance worker, who now looked significantly less relaxed, if there was somewhere I could get something to eat that would not cause me gastrointestinal difficulties, and he very kindly showed me this place. She looked at Qurel apologetically. I hope I have not gotten you into trouble. Qurel said in a careful tone that he hoped not either. Delegate Voss, said Sovi Drak, with the patience of someone holding a great many things together through sheer force of will. At 1800 station time, all residential monitoring systems experienced a simultaneous failure. I know, said Dara Voss. The lights in my room flickered. I noticed. During that 11-minute window, an unauthorized access attempt was made on the summit's classified negotiation archive. Dara Voss was quiet for a moment. That is serious, she said. Yes, said Sovi Drak. I was in my room until Dara Voss appeared to calculate. About 1807? 1808? I waited a few minutes after the lights came back to make sure the power situation had stabilized, and then I came to find something to eat. She paused. Is that a problem? The timing? The access attempt occurred during the blackout, said Sovi Drak. We are accounting for all delegate locations during that window. I understand, said Dara Voss. She folded her hands on the table. I cannot account for my location during the blackout because there was no monitoring. I was in my room, but I cannot prove that because your systems were not recording. That is your concern. It was not a question. It was a clean, accurate summary of the situation. Sovi Drak looked at her. Yes. Okay, said Dara Voss. She picked up her cup and took a careful sip. What do you need from me? The question hung in the air for a moment. Sovi Drak had arrived here, I suspect, prepared for denial, or legal deflection, or the kind of careful diplomatic maneuvering that experienced delegates used when placed in uncomfortable positions. She had not arrived prepared for "what do you need from me," delivered with the calm practicality of someone who had looked at a problem and decided cooperation was the most sensible response. I need you to return to your quarters, said Sovi Drak. A security officer will be posted outside your door until this matter is resolved. That is completely fine, said Dara Voss. She began stacking her tray. Can I finish this first? I have not actually had a complete meal today, and I think I will be a more useful cooperative participant in an investigation if I am not actively hungry. Another long pause. You have 5 minutes, said Sovi Drak. I sat down. I do not know exactly why I sat down. It was partially because I had been standing for several hours, and partially because something about the situation made me feel like sitting was the right action, and I was not always good at explaining my instincts before I acted on them. Breck sat down too, next to me, with the expression of someone who has given up questioning the trajectory of events. Sovi Drak did not sit, but she also did not leave, which meant that for 5 minutes we all occupied the same table in the maintenance break room, while Dara Voss ate the rest of her meal with the unhurried focus of someone who meant it when she said she was hungry. Qurel, the maintenance worker, had eased himself slowly along the bench toward the far edge of the table during this time and was now technically sitting at a different table, which I found extremely relatable. Chief Drak, said Dara Voss, about 3 minutes in. Sovi Drak looked at her. The access attempt, the classified archive. Do you know what they were trying to reach, specifically? Sovi Drak considered whether to answer. The South Corridor files, she said finally. Dara Voss nodded slowly. That is what I would have guessed, she said, given this cycle's agenda. Why do you say that? Because the South Corridor is the only item on this summit's agenda that is worth conducting illegal espionage for. Everything else is either already in the public record, or is the kind of negotiation where leaking the positions ahead of time would just embarrass people, not change outcomes. She set down her cup. The South Corridor positions are different. If someone knew in advance what the Velmunta were prepared to concede, or what the Dorvani remnant was actually asking for behind the formal language, that would be worth real action. The table was very quiet. You have thought about this, said Sovi Drak. I read the agenda very carefully, said Dara Voss. It is my job. She picked up her tray and stood. Ready when you are. The walk back to the delegate residential wing took about 8 minutes through the station's internal corridors. Sovi Drak walked beside Dara Voss. The 2 officers walked behind. Breck and I walked behind the officers, at which point we were clearly not part of the official escort and were simply 2 observers who had become attached to a situation and could not quite detach. Partway through the walk, Passing through the corridor junction that connected sub-level 4 to the main residential spine, Dara Voss said, conversationally, "Chief Drak, the 7 drones that went down this morning, have your technicians found a cause?" "That is an ongoing investigation," said Sovi Drak. "Of course. I am just asking because I have been thinking about it." Dara Voss paused at a junction to let a maintenance cart pass, then kept walking. "When I worked in my previous posting, before diplomatic service, I spent 2 years in technical communications, specifically in signal interference analysis. And what you described this morning, the sequential failure pattern, the way the scanner went first and then the drones in rapid succession, that is not what you would expect from a localized interference source." Sovi Drak's pace did not change, but the quality of her attention did. "Explain," she said. "A localized source, something on my person or in my bag, would produce a gradient effect. Systems closest to the source fail first, then progressively further ones, with an observable delay pattern. What you described was more like a cascade, one failure triggering the next, which suggests the failures were not caused by an external signal, but by something in your systems themselves." She glanced at Sovi Drak. "Something my arrival at the checkpoint triggered, not caused." Sovi Drak walked 3 full steps before responding. "What would trigger that kind of cascade?" "A pre-existing vulnerability," said Dara Voss. "A dormant fault in the system architecture that activates under a specific input. My scan data was unusual enough, a completely baseline biological reading with no modifications, no implants, no signals of any kind, in a setting where the scanners are calibrated for detecting hidden things, that it might have produced an unexpected data state that your system was not designed to handle." "You are saying our security system failed because your scan was too clean," said Sovi Drak. "I am saying it is a possibility worth looking into," said Dara Voss. "It would also mean the failure was already in your system before I arrived, which means whoever put it there did so before the summit began, which means someone was planning for the monitoring blackout well in advance." Another pause, "and probably planning for it to happen when something else was drawing everyone's attention." The corridor went quiet except for footsteps. "Like a new delegate at the checkpoint," said Sovi Drak. "Like anything unusual," said Dara Voss. "I just happened to be the unusual thing today." We had reached the residential wing. Sovi Drak stopped outside Dara Voss's quarters and held the position for a long moment, and I watched her processing something in the specific way that very intelligent, very thorough people process information that has just reorganized their understanding of a situation. "You said you worked in signal interference analysis," Sovi Drak said. "For 2 years, yes. And your current role?" "Diplomatic representative. 3rd cycle. Your file does not mention the technical communications background in significant detail." Dara Voss smiled at her. It was a small, quiet smile, not the bright one she had used at the checkpoint this morning. This one was more considered. "Diplomatic files summarize what is relevant to the role," she said. "The technical background is relevant to me personally. I did not expect it to come up at a summit." She went into her room. The door slid shut. The officer Sovi Drak posted took position beside it with the carefully blank expression of a being who was doing their job and preferred not to think too much about the surrounding context. Sovi Drak stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then she looked directly at me, which was startling because I had been operating under the working assumption that my presence in her security investigation had been tolerated rather than acknowledged. "You are the Thessan observer," she said. "Yes," I said. "Qurel, why are you following this situation?" I considered being diplomatic. Then I considered that Sovi Drak would almost certainly prefer direct. "Because something about it is not what it looks like," I said, "and I have been doing this long enough to recognize when that is true." She studied me. "What do you think it looks like?" "It looks like a suspicious new delegate who disrupted your security systems, disappeared during a monitoring blackout, and cannot account for her movements during an unauthorized access attempt." I paused. "Which is precisely what someone would arrange for it to look like if the actual goal was something else." "And what is the actual goal?" "I do not know yet," I said, "but I think you might be thinking about the same thing I am." Sovi Drak said nothing for a moment. Then, "Stay available." She walked away down the corridor. Brek exhaled. "We should go back to our quarters," he said. "Probably," I agreed. Neither of us moved. I stayed available as instructed. Brek went to his quarters, recorded his observer notes, and sent me a message approximately every 20 minutes with updates ranging from "nothing is happening" to "I heard a sound in the corridor and it was a maintenance cart" to "I have reread the session transcript 3 times," And I think the Garathi cluster's objection to the seating arrangement was not about the seating arrangement, that last one I saved, because Brek is tiresome most of the time, but he is occasionally very good at noticing things sideways. At 2200 station time, my communicator produced a notification that was not from Brek. It was from Sovi Drak's office. A terse message containing a location and a time, 30 minutes from now, and no other information. I recognized this for what it was. Not an invitation, a summons. The location was a secure briefing room on the security level of the station, 2 floors below the residential wing. When I arrived, Sovi Drak was already there, along with 3 of her senior officers, and seated at the end of the table with a cup of something warm and her data slate open in front of her. Dara Voss. She looked up when I came in. "Oh good," she said, with the tone of someone who is genuinely pleased at a development. "Qurel, right. Good." I sat down. I did not ask why I had been included. I suspected I was there because Sovi Drak had decided that an outside observer in the room was strategically useful, and a Thessan secondary observer was unlikely to have a stake in the outcome significant enough to compromise his objectivity. I was content to be useful in that way. Sovi Drak opened the briefing without preamble, which is my preferred way for briefings to open. "My technical team completed a preliminary analysis of the drone failure event this morning," she said. "Delegate Vorthax's assessment was correct. The failure pattern indicates a pre-existing Cascade fault in the system architecture. The fault was dormant and would not have been visible in standard system checks. It was designed to activate on a specific input condition." "What condition?" asked one of her officers. "A baseline biological scan. No modifications. No implants. No embedded signals. The system was calibrated to handle modified readings, standard unmodified readings within normal parameters, and flagged anomalous readings. What it was not calibrated to handle was an unmodified reading from a species it had very limited baseline data on." She paused. "The fault was designed to exploit a specific gap in our calibration database. The gap corresponds precisely to humans." The room was quiet. "Someone knew a human delegate would be attending this cycle," said Dara Voss. "Yes," said Sovi Drak. "And they planted this fault before the summit began, knowing that my scan would trigger it, knowing that the drone failure would create the security disruption they needed to conduct the archive access attempt." Dara Voss said this with the flat steadiness of someone who is working through the logic of a situation that personally concerns them and has decided that being unsettled by it is less useful than understanding it. "The fault was introduced into our systems approximately 9 days before the summit opening," said Sovi Drak, "during a routine maintenance window." "9 days," I said. Everyone looked at me. I continued. "The delegate roster for this summit was finalized 22 days in advance. The decision to include a human representative was announced 14 days before opening. Anyone who had access to the roster announcement would have known a human delegate was coming." "Yes," said Sovi Drak. "The timing confirms this was planned specifically around the human delegation's attendance." Dara Voss was very still, not the stillness of someone who was afraid, something more considered. She was looking at the table, not at anything on it, just at the surface, in the way of someone thinking so thoroughly that their visual system has essentially excused itself from the meeting. "The archive access attempt," she said. "The South Corridor files. You said you traced the access to a terminal 3 corridors from my room." "Yes." "What is 3 corridors from my room?" Sovi Drak looked at her officer Petro, who checked his data slate. "Corridor Junction G7. The terminal there is classified as a secondary administrative access point. It is low priority and not typically included in active monitoring sweeps." "Low priority," Dara Voss repeated. "So during a monitoring blackout, if someone needed to use a terminal that would be checked last and documented least thoroughly, that would be a good choice." "Correct. And the 11 minutes of missing footage from that terminal. The footage deletion was localized. Only that terminal's recording was removed from the archive. Everything adjacent is intact, which means someone had access to the security archive itself," said Dara Voss. "Selective deletion from a security archive requires elevated permissions. That is not a delegate. That is someone with station-level access." Sovi Drak said nothing, which was itself a form of confirmation. "You already knew this," said Dara Voss. "We identified the permissions level required for a selective deletion of that nature early in the investigation," said Sovi Drak. "It narrows the field of potential actors significantly." "How significantly?" I asked. "To 14 individuals currently aboard Praxxis Station," said Sovi Drak. 11 Vithosi staff, 2 contracted maintenance personnel from the Dorvani remnant, and one independent technical consultant engaged by the summit organizing committee. I had a thought. The technical consultant, I said. Every person in the room looked at me except Dara Voss, who was already looking at Sovi Drak. The technical consultant who would have been aboard the station 9 days before the summit opening, Dara Voss said, during the maintenance window when the Cascade fault was introduced. Yes, said Sovi Drak, we are aware. Have you located them? We are in the process, said Sovi Drak, and in the gap between those 4 words there was a great deal of information about how the process was going, and none of it was encouraging. Dara Voss took a long sip of her warm drink. She set the cup down. She looked at Sovi Drak directly. Tell me what you need, she said. Your technical background, said Sovi Drak. The signal interference analysis work. During that period, did you work with Cascade fault architecture? I did, said Dara Voss. Could you identify the signature methodology used to construct the fault we found? Dara Voss was quiet for a moment. Possibly, if I had access to the technical specifications of what your team found. The construction of a Cascade fault is not generic. It requires specific knowledge, and it tends to reflect the techniques of whoever built it. A methodology signature is not always definitive, but it can narrow things down considerably. She paused. Is this why you brought me here? Partially, said Sovi Drak. What is the other part? Sovi Drak looked at her with the 4-sensor focus that I now knew to be her version of intense scrutiny. The other part is that you are the only person aboard this station who has both the technical background to analyze this fault and no conceivable motive to have created it. The disruption was designed to make you look suspicious. Whoever constructed it needed you to look suspicious. That means making you part of the solution is, from a certain perspective, the most direct way to identify who arranged the problem. Dara Voss looked at her. You want to use me as bait? I want to use your expertise, said Sovi Drak. The fact that your involvement may provoke a response from the party responsible is an additional operational consideration. That is a very diplomatic way to say yes, said Dara Voss. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. Sovi Drak's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I think she had expected more negotiation. You agree? Yes, but I want something in return. Not for myself, for the summit. She leaned forward slightly. Whatever the South Corridor intelligence they were trying to steal would have told them, the fact that the attempt was made tells us something already. Someone needed that information badly enough to plant a fault in a galactic security system 9 days in advance and frame a delegate from a provisional species for it. That is not a casual decision. That is a committed, resourced, pre-planned operation. She looked at Sovi Drak. The South Corridor sessions resume tomorrow morning. I want High Delegate Orvac to know before those sessions begin that someone tried to steal the negotiation files. Not the details of the investigation, just that fact. Because the delegates who are about to negotiate in good faith deserve to know that someone in or adjacent to this process is not. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the tense silence of an investigation or the uncomfortable silence of an accusation, something more like the silence of a decision being made. That is a significant political recommendation for a provisional delegate, said Sovi Drak. I know, said Dara Voss. I am making it anyway. Sovi Drak looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, agreed. I will not detail the next 4 hours with the granular specificity that I could, because some of it is genuinely technical in ways that I am not qualified to relay accurately, and some of it is still subject to the ongoing investigation, and some of it I was asked politely but firmly to wait outside during, which I did, with Breck, who had apparently been summoned to the security level sometime during the briefing, and had arrived to find me already there, and had made the sound that meant resigned acceptance of a situation. What I can tell you is this. Dara Voss spent 3 hours in the technical analysis room with 2 of Sovi Drak's engineers and the specifications of the Cascade fault. At approximately 0100 station time, she walked out of that room and went directly to Sovi Drak and said 4 words, I know the school. The school, as she explained it, was not an educational institution. It was the term used in technical communication circles for the methodology framework a specific group of engineers developed and trained in. The Cascade fault's construction had a signature that was consistent with a particular school of Cascade architecture developed in the Dorvani Remnants Technical Institute about 15 years ago. It was a specific identifiable approach that was not widely known outside a relatively small community of practitioners. This narrowed the field of potential architects dramatically. combined with the list of 14 individuals with sufficient permissions access and the timing of the maintenance window Sovi Drak had by 0130 station time, a name. I did not learn the name that night. That information was contained in the portion of events I was waiting outside for. What I learned later, through official channels and the kind of careful conversation that happens in the days following major events, was that the technical consultant engaged by the Summit Organizing Committee had been recruited by a third party with significant interest in the South Corridor negotiations, had planted the Cascade fault during their access window, and had been relying on the monitoring blackout and the resulting confusion around Dara Voss to obscure both the access attempt and their own movements during the critical window. What they had not anticipated was that the suspicious new delegate they had selected as their smokescreen had a technical communications background, a working knowledge of Cascade fault architecture, an instinct for the shape of a frame, and the specific quality of being an observer of galactic events who had decided cooperation was more interesting than self-protection. The consultant was located in the station's secondary technical hub at 0214 station time, in the middle of a very unconvincing attempt to look like they were performing routine maintenance. The arrest was accomplished without incident. The drones, by this point, were operational again. I was told they functioned flawlessly. The second session of the Galactic Summit opened the following morning with a brief address from High Delegate Orvac that was, by his standards, notably direct. He informed the assembled delegates that a security matter had been identified and resolved overnight, that the integrity of the summit proceedings had been maintained, and that the detailed report would be provided to all delegations through the standard diplomatic channel within 24 hours. He did not name Dara Voss. He did not name the arrested consultant. He said what needed to be said, and then he moved to the agenda. He did, however, at the conclusion of his brief address, nod toward the human seat at the central table. It was a small movement, barely visible from the observer rings, but in Vethosi gesture language, a nod from a high delegate toward a junior representative in a formal session is a specific and recognized acknowledgement. It means, your conduct has been noted and is considered honorable. It is not something given lightly. It is not something given often. Dara Voss, who I strongly suspect understood exactly what it meant because she had read every available document on Vethosi cultural protocol before attending this summit, accepted it with a slight incline of her head in return, which was the correct response, and then opened her data slate and prepared for the session. Toss. The Velmonta delegate seated beside her said something quiet. She replied. He nodded, and the shoulder plating did the small movement again that his liaison had noted the previous day. The Gorathi cluster rippled in what I had now identified as their affirmative pattern. The South Corridor session proceeded. I will not tell you how it concluded, because those negotiations are ongoing and the details are appropriately confidential. What I will tell you is that they proceeded, that the delegates who entered those discussions did so with the knowledge that someone had tried to compromise them and had failed, and that awareness, that collective understanding that the process had been tested and held, gave the sessions a quality that the cultural liaisons and veteran observers around me noted was unusual. Not warm, exactly. These were hardened political representatives of species with complicated histories and competing interests, but something more like honest. More like people who had seen what the alternative looked like and had decided that the table they were sitting at, imperfect as it was worth taking seriously. After the closing of the second session, I found Dara Voss in the secondary catering station again. She had her tray, her cup, and her data slate, and she was eating a meal that was apparently significantly more agreeable to human biology than the previous day's options. She looked tired in the way of someone who has not slept enough but has done something worth the cost of not sleeping. She looked up when I sat down. Qurel, she said. Delegate Voss, I said. She smiled. Dara, she said. We have been through enough at this point. Dara, I said. I folded my hands on the table in what I now understood was the gesture she used to signal openness. I was not sure it translated across species. She noticed it and her smile changed slightly in a way that suggested she registered the attempt. You are going to ask me something, she said. Yes, I said. The system failures this morning. When you arrived at the checkpoint, you said to Sovi Drak that you genuinely did not know what happened. That is true, she said. But after you understood the Cascade fault and the mechanism, you knew that your unmodified scan was the trigger. Yes, she said, which means the system was designed to fail when you arrived, which means whoever planned this needed you to be the trigger, and for that to work, you needed to arrive at that checkpoint as you did. I paused. Without a security team, alone, with a clean scan, You walked into the most security-intensive checkpoint in the known galaxy, alone, without any apparent precaution, and that specific approach was what activated the fault that was designed to frame you. Dara Voss looked at me steadily. "Are you asking if I knew?" she said. "I am asking," I said, "what kind of person walks into a Galactic Summit checkpoint alone?" She was quiet for a moment. She took a sip from her cup. "A delegate from a provisional species at her first major summit," she said, "who has read extensively about how new delegates from smaller species are perceived in these settings. Who knows that arriving with a large security presence would be read as either threatening or performative. Who decided that the most effective way to represent her species was to walk into the room like she belonged there and trust that her conduct would do the work that her species has not yet had time to earn the reputation for." She looked at me directly. "I walk into rooms alone," she said, "because that is what I think humans should do right now. Not because we are fearless, because we understand that the alternative is arriving already defended, and arriving already defended tells every person in the room that you expect them to be a threat, and we are new here, and we cannot afford that." I sat with that for a moment. I turned it over the way you turn over a thought that has more dimensions than you initially registered. "That is," I said, "a very precise calculation. It is also just," she said, "how I prefer to operate. The calculation and the preference happen to agree." I nodded. Outside the catering station, through the single porthole in the far wall, I could see a small section of the stars that surrounded Praxxis Station. They were, as always, completely indifferent to everything happening around them. This is a quality I have sometimes envied and sometimes found deeply cold, depending on the day. "You know," I said, "Breck predicted that the Garathi would cause a scene at the catering station." Dara Voss blinked. "What?" "My colleague. He has a habit of anticipating the worst possible development for any given situation. Was he right?" "No," I said, "not even slightly. The scene came from somewhere else entirely." She laughed. The real laugh, the short, quick, entirely genuine one. "I am sorry about that," she said. "Do not be," I said. "It was considerably more interesting." She looked out the porthole. She had the expression of someone who has come a long way and knows there is farther still to go and is at peace with this. Perhaps even a little pleased by it. "Qurel," she said. "Yes. Thank you for following us into that security office yesterday morning, and for staying." I considered my response for a moment. In Thessan protocol, accepting gratitude from a delegate of another species in an unofficial context is a politically nuanced thing. I considered the protocol for exactly as long as it took me to decide that I did not care about it at this particular moment. "It was," I said, "the most interesting day I have had in 47 rotations of service." She smiled. We sat in the maintenance crew's catering station, with its practical, unforgiving lights and the faint smell of machine lubricant, and finished our respective meals. Around us, the station hummed with the ordinary business of a day's work continuing. Somewhere above us, in the corridors and conference halls, a galactic summit that had nearly been compromised was proceeding, imperfect and complicated and real, the way that things which are worth having tend to be. The security drones were operational. The South Corridor files remained unread by anyone who was not supposed to read them. And somewhere in the station's holding facility, a technical consultant was having a very long and increasingly regrettable evening. And a human had walked into the Galactic Summit unarmed, caused every drone in the building to fall out of the sky, gotten escorted to a security office, eaten 2 separate meals in the maintenance catering station, helped identify a pre-planned espionage operation, received a nod from a Vithosi High Delegate, and was now sitting across from me looking like someone who had merely had a reasonably full day. I want to be very clear about something, now that I am concluding this account. I, Qurel of the 6th Bract of Thessa, have been doing diplomatic observation work for 47 rotations. I have seen species negotiate, argue, collapse, recover, and evolve in real time. I have seen the best and the most cynical sides of interspecies cooperation. I have considerable experience of the galaxy, and I had never, before Dara Voss walked through that checkpoint with her single bag and her bright smile and her complete refusal to acknowledge that she was in any way outmatched, I had never watched someone turn a frame into a foundation. She was designed by her opponents to look like the problem. She became instead the solution. I filed my observer report the following morning. It was comprehensive and it was accurate, and it contained in the summary section a single line that I stand behind completely. The human delegation's performance at this summit cycle represents a case study in the operational value of uncalculated honesty, which is, upon reflection, the most calculated approach of all. My supervisor sent back a note asking me to revise the phrasing. I did not revise the phrasing. I have been doing this long enough to know when something is worth writing down exactly as it was. And this, all of it, exactly as it was, is worth writing down.